Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener supported radio. And now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio, the #1 listener-supported internet radio at Revolution.radio. My lovely co-host Leah Schaefer's with us today.
Hello.
And we are going to have a fantastic show. In fact, the title of the show is going to be Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps. And that is care of a good friend of the channel's and ours, Robert Felix, God rest his soul, who wrote the book in 2008.
Called Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps.
Exactly. Now,
pretty cool book.
In order to understand what the book means, if you haven't read it, it's pretty important to understand what's going on in the world of evolution. Do you have any anything to start with? Any opening thoughts, Leah?
I mean, it's an interesting discussion because there are a lot of traditional evolutionary ideas that are challenged when we talk about this concept. And at the same time, this paper that I reviewed about geomagnetic field intensity and how it might be related to extinctions kind of still relies on a lot of those old ideas. So it's a little bit difficult to untangle in certain senses, but maybe it's not. Maybe what's happening is a lot simpler than we might think.
Yeah, true that. And by the end of this hour, what you're going to understand is that there are many things that are controlling evolution. And evolution isn't a dirty word. The indoctrinated stories that back up the theory of evolution are the dirty words, and they're still intermingled in books. Just like you said, and even in the most modern paper with the most cutting breakthroughs is still using the old ideas. Now,
well, but it's even a little bit more complicated than that in the sense that you have a lot of scientists that are working with literally looking at the DNA and mapping out these phylogenetic tree branching that's happening right amongst particular species, and it's that specialization in and of itself is pretty in-depth and complicated. So I find it difficult to really evaluate the value of that. Just because I don't have the background knowledge. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. And before we get specific, what we're gonna show you is that there isn't just one type of evolution going on. And for a long time, they had a simple story, and then the simple story changed. But the way you can think of evolution now is happening in at least 3 different types of ways. One is this catastrophic replacement. Another one is very similar. We'll get to it, punctuated equilibria. And the other one is what she's talking about, is where you can actually watch small gene expressions change over time, and then an actual species becomes something else. Now, I think that is the rarest kind of evolution. And what we're going to show is what Robert Felix put out there in 2008, that most speciation, the creation of new species, happens instantaneously, so to speak. And, well, we're going to give you some explanations on why that might happen. So to start with, we all know about the origin of species, and you can see this up there, Leah?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the famous work by Charles Darwin. But before we get to the history, I'll do a little 5-minute history on evolution here in a second. This is how most people think of evolution, in a sense of, this is from a regular textbook from grade school. And what this shows is a single cell at the bottom, turning into multi-cells and then growing into jellyfish and worms, and then eventually animals.
You know what's funny about this that never occurred to me till just now? It reminds me of Big Bang Theory, right? We start with a singularity and then it explodes and expands and becomes more detailed and specific. So that's kind of interesting because it's sort of the same concept.
Yeah, and if you're just doing some kind of visual consideration of this graphic, what it shows is that insects are the same as birds, are the same as mammals. but that the fish are below all of that. And, you know, octopus are dumb. They're below snails. So this is a kind of a weird chart, but many people can relate to this. And when they see this, if I showed this to someone, what is this showing? They'd be like, oh, it's evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the chimpanzee to the upright human graphic.
I am very fond, however, of the version of this that involves the ape carrying a TV and then becoming like more like an ape as you continue on, if you've ever seen that.
Oh, he gets dumber.
Yeah.
They've tried to make it look more academic by drawing pictures like this, but it's incorrect because there were hominids at the same time living alongside of each other, like Neanderthal and Denisovan. At the same time, Homo sapien was around, perhaps. And so it's not, none of them came from the other.
Right. By the way, I just read that Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans probably lived with each other for potentially almost 5,000 years, maybe a little bit more than that.
Yeah,
that's a long time.
I think it's much longer.
Could very well be.
Yeah, because there's versions of Homo sapiens that they're not calling anatomically correct humans or Cro-Magnon that go back 120,000 years. So that means that Neanderthal and humans would have been commingling for 80,000 years.
Right.
Which is a very long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of this, people also associate evolution with Charles Darwin and the islands and his finches. And this is where the whole theory of natural selection came. But it starts much earlier than that. And the problem is here, no one could really get any evolutionary thought or endeavor off the ground because of something called the church. And anything that goes against the Bible is going to be blasphemy. So it was very difficult. Yeah,
because you have that argument of creationism versus evolution, right? Which is still ongoing, which is kind of interesting. But the essence of the creationist argument is that the world is in a state of constant creation. So literally, like every moment, every creature, every leaf, every blast of wind is created by God in that moment. That it doesn't have like an agent of change unto itself. Like evolution is sort of more like how Newton thinks, where it's like cause and effect and self-determined, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And the problem in the beginning of all this evolutionary thought was that they were, mixing science with religion. And it kind of got stuck in that problem. But evolutionary concepts actually first appeared in Greek writings. In the work of, and these are interesting names, Anaximander and Empedocles. Those are two different people. Now, Anaximander proposed that animals could be transformed from one kind to another. And Empedocles speculated that they could be made up of various combinations of pre-existing parts. So,
like a chimera?
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of interesting. Now, the growth of scientific observation and experimentation led to some theories in evolution beginning to emerge in the mid-16th century. Despite the idea of human progress being central to the Enlightenment of the 18th century. And this did not lead to the theory of evolution. Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis proposed that spontaneous generation and extinction of organisms as part of his theory of origins. However, no advanced theory of evolution came from that. Did you read about any of his work?
I did. If I did, it was a very long time ago in college, and I don't remember. So.
Then there was Georges Louis Leclerc. He was a prominent naturalist of the time, and he explicitly considered and rejected the possible descent of several species from a common ancestor. Then the physician Erasmus Darwin, this is interesting, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, offered some evolutionary speculations in his book Zoonomia, but they had no real influence on any subsequent theories. Did you read about him?
Yes. But
Okay.
again, I'm not really remembering details. So
Yeah, and then it really explodes. So none of these people, they talked about it. They didn't write books. There was no traction until Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist. He devised the hierarchic system of plants and animal classifications and that tree kind of thing that we now use, which is still in use today.
yeah,
And he showed an inclination towards the ability of species to mutate. And this was a result of his observations among various species.
which is really interesting because apparently Carl Linnaeus did not believe that species could change.
Yeah.
That that one could turn into another or create a different. He did not believe that. He was more of a creationist.
But when he looked close and saw how close different species were, he said they must be spontaneously changing because you couldn't see it happening.
Right.
You couldn't see this evolution, but they're so close that they must just be changing.
Right. And you see all of these relations from one species to the other, and it's kind of natural to assume that one is becoming another.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have like the birth of the idea of evolution. We've got these trees. They're putting different species on the trees and trying to figure out which came from the other. And that is the birth of the whole concept of missing link here. And that's what Linnaeus probably struggled with. There are no missing links, but there's so many things that are so close, and there's so many things that are so different. So that's just the beginning thought. And then early in the 19th century, the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and this is where Lamarckism comes from, he presented a clearly stated evolutionary theory. And this theory, later known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics, was ridiculed at the time, like all new theories, and then thoroughly disproved in the 20th century. Now, do you have any comments on Lamarckism?
I don't.
And then it says, although it did contribute to the gradual acceptance of biological evolution.
Well, it sounds like the precursor to Darwinism, really.
Right. And then comes Charles Darwin, who knew about all this, including the work of his grandfather. Obviously, he had access to his notebooks. He's the founder of the modern theory of evolution, and that's from the 1859 Origin of Species. We could go on. There's been many other people through the eons that have worked on evolution, but no real breakthroughs come about until the 70s, when Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould posit the theory of punctuated equilibria. And it is now widely recognized as a useful model for one kind, look at this, of evolutionary change. And so this is something I want to point out, that modern evolutionary scientists, if they are good, know that evolution can be happening in different modalities.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the first thing that everyone needs to notice in the 70s, and which everyone had seen all the way back to Linnaeus, everyone was creating a morphology that's similar to B here, the tree-like morphology. But the reality of the fossil record, as a paleontologist, just like Gould and Eldredge were, when you pull out all the drawers, when you lie out all the fossils, there are no missing links. And this is now supported with recent genetic studies where these geneticists went out to try to disprove this. So they looked at species that were separated on either sides of the world that were not interacting. And they said there's going to definitely be genetic differences in the same species. And they found there to be no genetic differences, which blew their mind because it's impossible according to them.
Yeah.
So what Eldredge and Gould posited here is really misrepresented. This doesn't disprove Darwin's ideas in any way, or many of the other evolutionary biologists before Gould and Eldredge. But what it does show is that there is a type of evolution going on at this scale that needs an explanation, that there are these punctuated events, and species then disappear below the boundary layer, and then above it, there's all these new species.
Yeah, and just to clarify a little bit about punctuated equilibrium, it's the difference between evolution happening at a very specific time abruptly versus happening gradually. So the picture of this is kind of like a stair step change rather than a gradual change.
Right, and here's a simple explanation. I used to give it to my students when we had a lecture on it. What you need is just a few things, and this is a very advanced evolutionary concept that can be simply explained. What you need is, to begin with, is stasis, and that's what we're all experiencing on Earth. Nice, calm conditions for long periods of time. And here we have a picture of mollusks experiencing stasis. They're living and dying and getting fossilized every few thousand years or whatever, but some of them are out here and some are over here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you get a change, and the change leads to isolation. So we have these species that were the same species happily living everywhere, and then the conditions changed, and some get isolated from the rest of the population. So they're no longer interbreeding with them. They're in their own kind of little inbred Appalachian town.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get strong selection and rapid change. So in that isolated community, any mutation will express itself quite readily there. And if it is a beneficial mutation, it will quickly be inherited.
Mm-hmm.
And then you need no preservation. So during this rapid change and the changing conditions, there is no fossil record. So you miss the missing links. They needed an explanation for no missing links. So their explanation is there is no preservation of them if they do exist.
Mm-hmm.
And then everything goes back to normal, and you get reintroduction of the whole population back together. And the isolated group can no longer interbreed with the original group, thereby becoming a new species. So that's it in a whole nutshell.
Yep.
Any questions?
Well, I was just going to say, too, that I think there's a difference in the conceptualizing of all of this. When you have species change, like one concept of evolution really, and it's kind of illustrated in the diagrams that you showed, really relies on the idea of change over time, right? That this is all about descendants, whereas the other concept is more like, actually, we can have all of this variation in the genetic code, let's say the overall genetic code, all at the same time, right? It doesn't all have to stem back to an ancestor necessarily. I guess these diagrams don't really show it because both of these diagrams do show a common ancestor essentially. But
yes,
one is saying, you can have all this diversity all at the same time. The other one says that the diversity only develops over time.
Yeah, and they're both true. And that's what we're trying to get across here. Because a lot of people think that the idea of punctuated equilibria erases Darwin. Okay, here are some of the things it doesn't do. It doesn't suggest that Darwin's theory of evolution is wrong. It just says that their idea is right on top of his as well. So there's different modalities of evolution. There's the one, punctuated equilibria, that we mostly see. But at the same time, in those stasis times, Darwinian evolution has to be going on.
Yeah. Well, and that's sort of one of the cool things that has happened since Darwin's time is that, we do have a lot of other writers and thinkers about evolution who have been kind of building on Darwin as the basis while incorporating some of these ideas. Like Richard Dawkins is an example of that. So there's definitely a lot of conceptualizing going on overall.
Okay, but now the consensus is that punctuated equilibrium does not imply that evolution only happens in rapid bursts, because that's just one of the mechanisms. It happens many types of ways. And the deeper we go into it and the more science that has come out, the more is being revealed. So in 2008, Robert Felix's book comes out because as early as 1985, people have been looking into mechanisms for mass extinction. And I thought I had the 85 paper up, but I don't.
Oh, bummer.
but it basically said magnetic reversals and evolution, similar to this book title.
Right.
And they were suggesting that something happens during magnetic reversals that causes extinction. That's what it was called, magnetic reversals and extinctions.
Okay.
And so, but this book is a little different because this takes the idea of punctuated equilibria. You have a boundary where there's species that go extinct below and new species above. What happens at the boundary? And so Robert Felix looked into it, and he, at that time, the only real good information was on that extinction around 42,000 years ago, which we now know is 41,500 years ago with better data from the paper that you are now an expert on that we'll get to in the second half. And what that paper shows is that this punctuated equilibria may be occurring because of the magnetic field strength as it changes.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty good explanation.
Yeah, that's a pretty good broad overall general idea behind the paper. I mean, it doesn't definitively conclude that, but it certainly presents a broad array of evidence that suggests that pretty strongly.
And in 2008, Robert Felix was boldly going out there and saying that's what it is.
Yeah, yeah.
So kudos to him. Now, since then, there have been papers that have come out positing other mechanisms. Here's one: oxygen escape from the Earth during geomagnetic reversals and implications to mass extinction.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens as the field strength lowers, unfortunately, space gets closer because the dynamic pressure that's usually coming from the solar wind, which is creating the shield, the magnetosphere, which is big, weakens to the point in where space gets closer and closer. And since our magnetosphere has been waning over the last several decades, space has gotten tens of miles closer.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic. And so some people suggest that if there was a geomagnetic storm at very low field strength that could push the magnetosheath past the surface of the Earth, exposing it to space.
Wow.
And now what that would do is it would cause massive amounts of oxygen loss into space because of the pressure. It would also create a freezing cold bubble on the exact opposite side of the Earth due to pressure loss.
The other thing that's interesting about this concept of oxygen escape is simply that, largely the species that we lost were mega species. So larger animals require more oxygen. So that may be a factor.
Yeah, and dinosaurs were real big way back when.
Yeah.
Now, some of the biggest breakthroughs happening just this year are on ultraviolet radiation, and papers coming out on one of the biggest mass extinctions, the Permian mass extinction, where we have similar things to what's going on at the Younger Dryas, volcanic gases, and they then detected spikes in UVB radiation.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're positing that the radiation may be the cause of the mass extinction because it's a cascading biological catastrophe. You've got the plants suffering, you've got the animals suffering, then you're going to have breakouts of disease in plants and animals. It's basically a shit show.
Well, and then the UV, and this is one of the things that this paper gets into, and we'll get into this in a bit, but the UVB also can cause specific mutations and can affect specific genes that help biological organisms deal with the UVB. So you may end up with a situation where some animals have the ability to deal with the UVB better than others. And that's one of the things that this paper illustrates, particularly for Neanderthals versus anatomically modern humans, which is pretty interesting.
Until this paper came out, the argument over why Neanderthals, here is the breakaway point right there. Neanderthals end and Cro-Magnon begins is because of a massive fluctuation in the field strength here. And it put a strain on the biological entity. And what Leah is going to explain after the break is that modern man had a mechanism in his genetic code to protect himself from magnetic excursions, and the Neanderthal probably didn't.
Mm-hmm. Perfect timing.
See you in a few minutes.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine. Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
There have been imaginative science fiction writers for generations.
Be evasive.
But that doesn't mean that they're telling the truth as opposed to fiction.
I'm aware of some archaeologists that have uncovered large bones indicating giants in Virginia. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, indicating that there were giants before the Nephilim.
And sons of God, plural. They weren't talking about Jesus coming down and
No, that's right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm Steve Crawford. Join me every Thursday night in Studio A at 6 p.m. Eastern for Factor Theory Live. Find us on www.revolution.radio. Great guests and great stories. What do you believe?
Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
And we're back. So we did a recap on kind of evolutionary theory. And if you are a little confused, what we're going to share in the second half is the paper that Leah has become an expert on that we've been sharing for years on both channels to cover a whole host of topics. But that there, as far as evolutionary theory is concerned, we have biological evolution as described by Darwin in natural selection. We have punctuated equilibria that's happening when communities are isolated and mutate and then rejoin. And that is the idea of Eldridge and Gould. And then we come to what's the newest part that's being postulated right now, but no one's really said it out loud except Robert Felix, is that there is a third thing that happens. And these are the biggies. And so mass extinction events cause massive amounts of speciation and maybe complete changes in the whole makeup of the biome of the entire planet. We saw this with the extinction of the dinosaurs. We had a dino world for hundreds of millions of years, and then all gone. And now we're in a chicken world with people.
Yeah. Well, the chickens are the remaining dinosaurs, right? So
yeah, but that's a big change. They got shrunk down, and now we eat them. When before they were eating our heads.
They probably didn't get shrunk down. I mean, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. They might have just persevered through all of this. It could go one way or the other, right?
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So let's. I hope that was a good synopsis on the three different types of evolution that we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you see the screen now?
Yep.
All right. So what this is showing, and this comes from the paper. What's the title?
The title of the paper is The Role of Geomagnetic Field Intensity in Late Quaternary Evolution of Humans and Large Mammals.
Yeah, and a lot of people struggle with that word.
It is very hard to say.
Quaternary. It's like quarter without the R. You got to drop the R. Quaternary.
Right. And so this is a referring to a whole era, right? So this covers like extinctions around the Younger Dryas period, as well as the Lechamp excursion at 41,000.
Yeah, the late Quaternary period has been characterized by global climate fluctuations, according to the Googler. Are you still there? You froze up a little.
I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah, and so the paper basically discusses this time frame about 70,000 years.
Yeah.
And during that 70,000 years, there's quite a bit of magnetic fluctuation in the field strength. And the most significant being expressed in things like number of extinct taxa. There's a huge spike. Do you see this green part? Mm-hmm. This huge spike as it increases of extinction directly corresponds to the reduction in field strength. And when they saw this, it blew their mind because you go in independently to see if you find something, and what you find is so significant, it cannot be ignored.
And then there's this corroborating evidence. So if you look at the yellow squiggly lines under dung fungi influx rate, this is pretty interesting because this refers to a specific bacteria. I'm sorry, it's a fungus, excuse me, called Sporormiella. And this would feed on the poop specifically of herbivores. So you get this big herbivore die-off, and then you see a big drop in the amount of dung fungi in the record.
So to illustrate her point here, these huge spikes here at 57,000 years ago are indicative and suggestive of massive amounts of herbivores, millions of running around Earth. And this is going on for tens of thousands of years And then at the end of the magnetic field strength shift here, gone. The mammals are gone.
Yeah.
And the reason they're gone is it over here, massive amounts of extinctions, and it takes a long time to recover. It takes 10,000 years to recover when we get massive amounts of mammals again.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because it does kind of give you a picture in that time frame where the dung fungi influx rate is really high of massive diversity on Earth, right? And then going forward, a lot of that diversity disappears.
Yeah, and this paper goes on even further here. There is Gill et al. Is in here. This is a different paper where they looked at the Sporomiella up from the Younger Dryas event. And you can see the same massive spike here. Look, right as we come to 12.9, right before there. So there's a massive spike here at 14.7. I wonder why that is. That's the bowling Alarod warming. The world now is filled with mammoths and bison, and there are millions of them. And then they just, at 12.9 here, they go away. They're gone.
Right. So the essence of what,
as well as the dung
happening,
fungi.
Yeah. So like the essence of what's happening, right? It's like in those periods where we have all of these animals, we have a strong geomagnetic field that's shielding us from UV radiation. And so everybody's kind of thriving and surviving and doing well and happy and eating well. And then we lose the strength of that geomagnetic field intensity. We've got a lot of UV radiation coming in. And then there's some specific mechanisms that are probably coming into play, and they're probably different for different species, but that are causing extinctions. And I can get into the details of that in a bit.
Yeah, I want to point out one other thing here. Since the Younger Dryas event, after the Younger Dryas event at 12.9, it took over 6,000 years until the field strength recovered. There were 3 dips, 3 small magnetic excursions, one at 12.9, one at 11.5, and one happening here at around 8.9, which is a very cold period in the Holocene. Not until after that event do the large herds of animals return anywhere.
Yeah.
And the Sporomiella is kept to a minimum here for like 6,000 years. So the reason why we couldn't really build big cities, we didn't have that many animals on Earth yet.
Yeah.
So the only way.
Interesting.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's interesting too. Like if you look at the Lechamp excursion at 41,000, it appears that the field strength bounces back pretty strongly, but obviously it doesn't always happen that way.
No, it doesn't always happen. And I think that they do have a longer term. This is 300,000 years of field strength. And you can see that back at 200,000 years, we had a few excursions happening that they only locate 2 here, Pringle Falls and Iceland Basin. But the field strength was low for a very long extended period of time, except for that one spike in between. And back here during the Portuguese Orphan for about 40,000 years, very low field strength. And then again here, between the 2 Blake excursions.
Yeah.
Similar thing.
Surely was a tough time to live.
And so if we come up top here to the Younger Dryas event, it stays, the field strength stays low until about 10,000, recovers, and then drops back down again before it recovers again. And you can even see our current magnetic excursion that we're in on this paper. It's right here.
I was thinking about that looking at this graph.
And so we're actually down closer to 7 right here, which is bringing us close to Younger Dryas times.
Yeah, interesting.
So to get effects, you don't have to, all you have to do is get the 5.
Yeah.
When we were back at the Lechamp, went almost to 0. It went to 1.5-ish.
Yeah, that's a point where I would say probably that idea of oxygen escaping the atmosphere probably played a big role at that point, if the geomagnetic intensity is that low.
Well, and I think the biggest problem is the amount of radiation. So why don't we get into that?
Yeah. Okay, so this example is largely about the difference between Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans. I'm just going to call them AMHs from now on. Okay, when you've got a lot of UV radiation coming in, that UV radiation, I'm going to call that UVR from here on out, splits oxygen into oxygen radicals. And then those radicals will recombine to form ozone. And then that ozone acts as a sink for even more UVR, and then it'll split more oxygen into radicals. So that creates reactive oxygen species and ROS. And ROS will attack DNA and cause changes in the DNA. Specifically, you can get, like, especially UVB, you'll get apoptosis, which is cell death. You will get damage to nuclear DNA. You will get mitochondrial dysfunction, all of these things. So that's sort of the general idea of what UV radiation can do to any species, really. Oh, and then on top of that, if the magnetic field strength is low, you'll also get a lot of nitrogen oxides that are generated, and those will also deplete ozone. So you've got this kind of cascading effect of the protective ozone being degraded, and then also creating these reactive oxygen species that can affect plants, animals, anything really. So the specific, like, Neanderthal AMH example is about a particular receptor that's called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor. And what that does is it helps produce antioxidant enzymes that help an organism deal with reactive oxygen species. The difference between Neanderthal and anatomically modern humans is like a difference in the, I guess it's the proteins or the ligands of that particular receptor. So like Neanderthals, they found one Denisovian, non-human primates, rodents, they have this kind of archaic version of this receptor, whereas anatomically modern humans have a different version that allows them to deal with the reactive oxygen species better. Also, what's sort of interesting is that apparently the aryl hydrocarbon receptor can be, what is it here, can be generated in response to UV radiation from tryptophan. So you've got UVR coming in, and for whatever reason in the humans that exist at this time, it triggers this aryl hydrocarbon receptor to change to make it actually better able to deal with the UV radiation. But Neanderthals didn't have this ability, and so they didn't make it.
Yeah, and Denisovans neither?
I'm not sure, because apparently there's only been one Denisovan where they've identified that it has the archaic version of this receptor. So maybe, maybe not. Maybe some of them changed and some of them didn't.
Yeah, so interesting looking at this graph here where the extinction of the Neanderthals occurs. The extinction of the Neanderthals occurs after the first major drop down into the Lechamp, not during the deepest part.
Yeah.
There's a recovery in the field strength, and there's also a recovery in the dung fungi.
Yeah.
So there are groups of animals that proliferated during this time. After the drop down, a lot died off, but then some recovered here. And they stayed recovered for the entire second drop down. So they must have had some kind of immunity from the first drop down. But the second drop down was so severe that after it occurred, only after it does the dung fungi go away.
Yeah, yeah. And perhaps because of the lack of severity, it did create some more gradual change rather than an abrupt one. Like maybe some of those organisms could deal with the level of radiation to some degree, but then at a certain point, it just becomes too much.
Yeah, so if we come over to the lineage of upright humans here going back 300,000 years, you could see that a lot of the punctuated equilibria is expressed right here on this chart.
Yeah.
Where they have horizontal lines where multiple lineages pop up after a particular event. Now, if we go right here, this is the first Blake excursion. So we have a direct connection between magnetic field strength and this shift, this evolutionary, it's an extinction event with evolution happening on the other side.
Yeah.
And then again here, prior to the Lechamp here, same thing is happening on the tree. That these breakoffs, here's the Lechamp, the most severe. Look at all these breakoffs here at the Lechamp. And that's at the Neanderthal extinction.
Yeah.
That the magnetic field strength, the magnetic excursion. So if I wish Robert Felix could see this.
Yeah.
Because it would be a wonderful day.
Yeah. You know, there's a whole section in this paper that's really interesting that gets into a lot of the nitty-gritty about the phylogenetic tree of humans and, you know, tracking all of the DNA through millennia. A little bit technical, but what is fascinating is that what you see is that the branching in the phylogenetic tree of humans, where the branching happens, basically corresponds to these periods of very low geomagnetic field intensity. So, hello. I mean, correlation isn't causation, but
no, but UVA, UVB isn't the only thing coming in. Right. We're being bombarded with cosmic rays. And the only thing that we know that mutates genes are cosmic rays.
Well, and like I imagine that cosmic rays in many ways will essentially act like reactive oxygen species, right? I mean, reactive oxygen just basically means that you have an oxygen ion floating around that's waiting to interact chemically with something else. And that can be true of cosmic rays. It's the same thing. These are ionized elements that are waiting to interact with other chemicals. So you can get chemical changes, which can also apparently cause, especially reactive oxygen species, can cause genetic changes too.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we come back to this graph, it is so amazing. There's a section here between about 220,000 years to about 130,000 years. They call this speciation bottleneck.
Mm-hmm.
It's the time of the highest field strength for a continuous period. There are no real big excursions during this time, and there's no species being created in the Homo lineage until the first of the Blake excursions, when you get a split.
Mm-hmm.
And then another major excursion, you get a split. And then when the major speciation is happening up here, it's all on magnetic excursions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know what else is interesting about this too is that if you kind of review which mammals went extinct where and when, right? So you kind of you have a lot of differences between, let's say, what happened in North America versus Africa, as an example. They experienced bigger amounts of extinction at different time periods. And so the suggestion is that since ozone holes tend to be more at play at higher latitudes, like, for example, Africa to some degree may have been spared when we were in a period of low geomagnetic field intensity, which is kind of interesting because I think those location differences too are going to be playing a role in how and when and where new species emerge, right?
Yeah, I think we need to look into more because during these geomagnetic excursions, when the field strength gets low, it's getting low now. There's a threshold in the future where it gets so low that you don't just have two poles moving anymore. You'll get four poles. They split. It starts to become chaotic. In fact, there are some reconstructions of the Lechamp magnetic excursion that you can go view online that are complete havoc of the geomagnetic field. At some points, there are 8 poles all near the equator, and they're flipping around. Now, what that's going to do, if there's any space weather or solar storms headed our way, the aurora belt is no longer going to be confined to the Arctic and the Antarctic. So there's definitely going to be some migrating areas on the surface of the earth that are more or less in harm's way, so to speak.
Yeah. But I think too, like having different geographic regions that have different species making it or not, that's also going to contribute to the genetic diversity and changes going forward, right? Especially if those species meet somewhere in the future.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yes. But more importantly, I think in a context of preparedness, there is no safe place to go based on what we've just said.
Oh, that reminds me. I got to throw something else in there that is so interesting. That's mentioned in this paper and elsewhere, I think. So I did not know this, but did you know that hippopotamus sweat red? This is so fascinating. They have what's called red sweat. So they sweat, and once that sweat is exposed to oxygen, it turns red, which protects them from UV radiation. Now, it's really interesting, right? Because you have African tribes who have used red ochre on their skin for thousands of years that protects them from UV radiation. And then you also have things like red plankton that you find in alpine areas. That red color provides a level of protection. So it's so interesting because it's almost like, let's say, African humans watched what was happening with the hippopotamus. The hippopotamus is obviously still here.
Yeah.
So they probably observed that they were protected in some way and imitated them.
Well, this goes way further back than that. The red people, the Native Americans, the red people go back 8,000 years or even earlier.
Yeah. And then didn't the Egyptians use things like red ochre as well?
The Egyptians, the Minoans.
Yeah. So I'm thinking that like humans figured this out a long time ago in various places, and that's pretty interesting.
It's almost as if we've had advanced cultures that are much older than we know about.
Yeah, it does sort of seem like that, doesn't it?
Passing down information.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what this means is that during magnetic excursions, no place are safe. It's a random event. You can watch the poles move in one direction, but once it gets low, it's going to become chaotic. And so there's only one safe place. Where is that?
That's in a cave.
Underground, baby. Yeah. And you need to protect yourself. And like I was talking to Leah, it's not a total loss, but it is scary. Like during the peak times, if you're in a magnetic excursion, you can't go out during the day because you will literally fry and get skin cancer.
Well, that's another interesting thing about this is like, apparently it also depends on your genes, right? As I read this, I realized that as anatomically modern humans, we might sort of be okay. We may not, right? I mean, we still have differences in melanin and all kinds of things that allow us to deal with sun better than others. Diamond, as for example, with his heritage, will turn super tan, and I will just burn. But like there's another example that's really interesting. Apparently, elephants have there's an oncogene called TP53. And elephants have like 20 copies of this gene, whereas 2 extinct mammoths have less than 12 copies, and the American mastodon only had 3 to 8 copies. So it's quite possible that those genes helped those species make it or not.
Yeah, side note, a lot of people don't know that mammoths actually made it past the Younger Dryas boundary and lived in Siberia as early as 5,000 years ago.
Yeah, which is pretty interesting as well.
So let's sum it up. We've got 3 minutes here. So what we've covered based on all the science and everything up to this point is 3 evolutionary things happening. We've got slow natural selection that does occur, especially on isolated islands like the Galapagos, where you can have slow biological change due to necessity. Then you have the punctuated equilibria idea of Eldridge and Gould saying that you can have stasis for long periods, build species, and then have abrupt climate changes, which shift the stasis. Mutations happen, they reemerge, and then we've got new species. And then the most significant is the magnetic excursion, mass extinction, the dung fungi evolutionary process, where whoever doesn't potentially have this gene that protects them from low field strength doesn't make it. And the ones that do have more gene expression of it make it, which is good news for us, which means that in this magnetic excursion, humans are probably okay.
It's possible. I mean, or at least we might have some level of protection. I mean, that's certainly what the genetics suggest. And so it's probably the reason why we're here now.
You go underground. If you have to be out in the sun during the day, maybe red ochre all over your skin instead of sunscreen, which has benzene in it anyway and is killing you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and of course then there's this trade-off, right? Where it's like it's UV protection versus vitamin D absorption, right? So that sort of presents its own issues as well. I wonder if you can get vitamin D absorption while you're wearing red ochre. That would be an interesting question to answer.
Well, there's one tip that let's leave it on, is that the only other thing other than humans that create vitamin D using the sun are mushrooms. So if you grow mushrooms and you pick them and you actually put them out in the sun for 12 hours, the vitamin D will increase by tenfold.
Fascinating.
Then
but then what happens to the mushrooms during an excursion? We don't know. It's probably going to be pretty random, whatever changes occur.
All right. That was an awesome show. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Bye.